Summer of 1943. A small town in Texas. A local woman is hanging laundry in her backyard when she hears something strange. Singing. In German. She walks to the edge of her property and sees them. Dozens of men in uniforms, working in the cotton fields. German soldiers. In Texas. In America. She runs back inside and calls the sheriff. There are German soldiers in the Johnson's field. The sheriff chuckles. Yes, ma'am. That's the POW camp. Been there for 3 months now. She had no idea. Nobody told her. One day there were no German soldiers in her town. The next day, there were hundreds. This happened across America. In Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Utah, Montana, New York, Florida, Georgia, in nearly every state. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States held over 400,000 prisoners of war on American soil. German soldiers. Italian soldiers. Some Japanese. In camps built in small towns, on farmland, in forests. Most Americans at the time knew these camps existed, vaguely. But the details were kept quiet. The government didn't publicize it. Local newspapers mentioned it briefly, then moved on. And after the war ended, the camps were dismantled, the prisoners sent home, and the whole thing was quietly forgotten. Today, most Americans have no idea this happened. That their grandparents' generation lived alongside enemy soldiers. That German POWs picked cotton in Texas, harvested sugar beets in Colorado, worked in lumber camps in Wisconsin. That some of these prisoners liked America so much they returned after the war and became citizens. This is the story of the POW camps on U.S. soil. The camps in your backyard. The history your town forgot. December 1941. Pearl Harbor. America enters World War II. Within months, American forces are fighting in North Africa. By 1943, they're invading Italy. By 1944, they're landing at Normandy. And with every battle, American forces capture enemy soldiers. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Eventually, hundreds of thousands. Where do you put them? Initially, the U.S. military sends captured soldiers to POW camps in North Africa and Europe. British-run camps. Temporary holding facilities. But as the number of prisoners grows, this becomes logistically impossible. The camps overseas are overcrowded. Shipping supplies to maintain the camps strains already overtaxed supply lines. And keeping prisoners close to active war zones creates security risks. In early 1943, the U.S. government makes a decision. Bring the prisoners to America. The logic is straightforward. America is thousands of miles from the fighting. Escape is effectively impossible. Even if a prisoner somehow got out of the camp, where would he go? The nearest neutral country is Mexico, and Mexico is cooperating with the U.S. Plus, America has the resources to build and maintain camps, land, lumber, food, guards. The Geneva Convention of 1929 governs the treatment of prisoners of war. It's clear, prisoners must be housed in conditions similar to the captor nation's own soldiers. They must be fed adequately. They must receive medical care. They can be required to work, but not in war-related industries, and they must be paid. The United States follows these rules. Not out of pure altruism, though American values played a role, but because of reciprocity. The U.S. has its own soldiers in German and Japanese POW camps. If America treats German prisoners well, maybe Germany will treat American prisoners well. It's strategic. So the U.S. Army begins building POW camps across the country. The scale is massive. By the end of the war, there are over 500 POW camps and branch camps in the United States. The largest camps hold 10,000 to 15,000 prisoners. Smaller branch camps hold 500 to 1,000. The camps are built quickly. Many are converted from civilian conservation corps camps or military training facilities. Others are built from scratch, rows of wooden barracks, guard towers, barbed wire fences, mess halls, medical facilities, recreation areas. The locations are strategic. Camps are built in rural areas, away from major cities. Partly for security, if prisoners escape, they're in the middle of nowhere. Partly because rural areas need labor. With millions of American men serving overseas, farms and factories face severe labor shortages. German POWs can fill that gap. Let me give you some examples of where these camps were. Camp Alva, Oklahoma, held 3,000 German POWs. They worked on local farms, harvesting wheat and cotton. Camp Como, Mississippi, held 3,000 Italian POWs. They worked in lumber camps, cutting timber. Camp Rupert, Idaho, held 2,000 German POWs. They harvested sugar beets and potatoes. Camp Papago Park, Arizona, held German POWs, including U-boat crews and Afrika Korps soldiers. This camp is infamous for the largest POW escape attempt in U.S. history. 25 German officers dug a tunnel and escaped. All were recaptured within weeks. Camp Stark, New Hampshire, held German POWs who worked in logging operations. Camp Hearn, Texas, held German POWs, many of whom were hardcore Nazis. Internal camp tensions led to violence among prisoners. The prisoners arrive by ship, usually at East Coast ports like New York or Norfolk. They're transported by train to their assigned camps. For many, the train journey across America is their first glimpse of the country. They see cities, farmland, mountains. They see prosperity. America's industrial capacity is staggering compared to war-torn Europe. Some prisoners are shocked. They'd been told by Nazi propaganda that America was weak, decadent, on the verge of collapse. What they see is the opposite: abundance, infrastructure, power. Let me introduce you to one prisoner. His name was George Gartner. He was a German soldier, captured in North Africa in 1943. He was sent to a POW camp in New Mexico. Gartner later wrote about his arrival in America. "I expected to be treated badly. We were told Americans were barbaric, that we'd be starved and beaten. Instead, we were given clean barracks, hot meals, medical care. I couldn't believe it. I thought it was a trick. It wasn't a trick. It was policy." The camps operated under strict Geneva Convention rules. Prisoners received 3 meals a day. The food was comparable to what American soldiers ate, sometimes better than what American civilians had, since certain goods were rationed for civilians but not for POW camps. This caused resentment in some communities. Why are German prisoners eating better than us? Prisoners slept in barracks with cots and blankets. They had access to showers, latrines, medical care. They could send and receive mail, though it was censored. They could form sports teams, play soccer, organize classes. Many camps had small libraries with books in German or Italian. Prisoners who behaved well and volunteered for work assignments were paid 80 cents per day in scrip, camp currency that could be used in the camp canteen to buy cigarettes, toiletries, snacks. For many prisoners, especially those who had experienced the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front or North African desert campaigns, the American POW camps were comfortable. This created a strange dynamic. These were enemy soldiers, men who had fought against Americans, who had killed Americans, and now they were living in relative comfort in rural America, working on farms, playing soccer, learning English. How did Americans react? Let me take you inside one of these camps. This is based on historical records from Camp Concordia, Kansas, which held approximately 4,000 German POWs from 1943 to 1945. A typical day starts at 6 a.m. Wake-up call. Prisoners have 30 minutes to dress, wash, and prepare for morning roll call. 6:30 a.m. Roll call. Prisoners line up outside their barracks. American guards count them. This happens twice a day, morning and evening, to ensure no one has escaped. 7 a.m. Breakfast. The mess hall serves oatmeal or eggs, bread, coffee, sometimes fruit. The food is plain but adequate. Prisoners eat at long tables, hundreds of men at once. 8 a.m. Work assignments. Prisoners who have volunteered for work, about 80% of them do, are loaded onto trucks and driven to work sites. Farms, mostly. But also canneries, lumberyards, sugar beet processing plants. The work is hard. Harvesting cotton under the Texas sun. Digging irrigation ditches. Loading trucks. But compared to combat, it's safe. And the prisoners are paid, given breaks, provided water. George Gartner, the prisoner I mentioned earlier, was assigned to a farm near Roswell, New Mexico. He worked alongside Mexican-American laborers. At first, there was tension. These laborers had brothers, sons serving in the military, fighting against Germans. Why should they work alongside the enemy? But over time, something unexpected happened. They started talking. The language barrier was difficult. Gartner spoke limited English, the laborers spoke limited German, but they communicated. They shared food during breaks. They helped each other with the work. One day, one of the laborers asked Gartner, "Why did you fight for Hitler?" Gartner's answer, as he later recounted, "I didn't fight for Hitler. I fought for Germany. I was a soldier. I followed orders. I'm not a Nazi. I never was." This was true for many prisoners. The camps held a mix: hardcore Nazi believers, regular soldiers who were just doing their duty, and anti-Nazi Germans who despised Hitler but had been conscripted anyway. The camps reflected this. In some camps, Nazi prisoners terrorized non-Nazi prisoners. There were beatings, intimidation, internal power structures where fanatical Nazis controlled the barracks and punished anyone who expressed doubts about the Reich. In Camp Hearn, Texas, a German POW named Johannes Kunz was beaten to death by fellow prisoners because they suspected him of informing on escape plans. His killers were tried by U.S. military court, convicted, and hanged. It was one of the few times the internal violence in POW camps became public. But in other camps, the atmosphere was different. Prisoners who weren't Nazis, and there were many, found themselves in an environment where they could finally speak freely. They could criticize Hitler. They could read uncensored newspapers. They could listen to American radio. The U.S. military had a program called re-education. The goal was to expose German prisoners to democratic ideals, to show them that democracy worked, that America was strong precisely because it was free. Prisoners attended classes on American history, government, and culture. They watched American films, not propaganda, but regular Hollywood movies. They read American newspapers and magazines. They interacted with Americans who weren't soldiers, farmers, shopkeepers, townspeople. For some prisoners, this was transformative. They started to question everything they'd been taught. If America was supposed to be weak and degenerate, why was it so powerful and prosperous? If Americans were supposed to be the enemy, why were they treating prisoners with decency? George Gartner later said, "Working on that farm in New Mexico changed me. I saw how Americans lived. They weren't evil. They were just people. Hard-working people. And I realized the propaganda I'd been fed was lies." But not all prisoners changed. Some remained loyal Nazis until the end. They refused to participate in re-education programs. They sang Nazi songs in the barracks. They harassed prisoners who cooperated with Americans. This created tension not just among prisoners, but between prisoners and guards. American guards were mostly young soldiers deemed unfit for combat, too old or injured or lacking combat training. They were assigned to guard POWs. It was considered a safe, boring job. And mostly, it was. But there were incidents. Prisoners who tried to escape. Prisoners who attacked guards. Prisoners who caused disturbances. The guards had orders to shoot escapees on sight. Some did. Between 1943 and 1946, approximately 56 POWs were killed while trying to escape from camps in the United States. Escapes were rare, though. Why would you escape? Where would you go? You're in the middle of Kansas or Texas or Idaho. You don't speak English fluently. you have no money. The nearest border is hundreds of miles away. And if you're recaptured, which you almost certainly will be, you face punishment. Still, some tried. The most famous escape was from Camp Papago Park, Arizona, in December 1944. 25 German officers dug a 178-foot tunnel over several months. They escaped through the tunnel and scattered into the desert. All were recaptured within 6 weeks. Most were found within days, dehydrated and starving. One officer, Jürgen Wattenberg, made it to Mexico but was caught there and returned. The escape became a local legend. Arizona newspapers covered it extensively. The army was embarrassed. But no one was seriously hurt, and the escapees were punished with solitary confinement, then returned to the camp. Most prisoners didn't try to escape because life in the camps was tolerable. They had food, shelter, safety. The war was far away. They could wait it out. And some prisoners didn't want to leave because they liked America. The camps were in small towns, rural communities where everyone knew everyone. And suddenly, there were thousands of German soldiers living just outside town. How did the locals react? It varied. Some communities were hostile. They'd lost sons, brothers, husbands in the war. German prisoners were the enemy. They didn't want them here. Didn't want to see them. Didn't want to interact with them. Other communities were more pragmatic. The prisoners provided labor. They worked farms, kept businesses running. Without them, crops would rot in the fields. The local economy would collapse. So the community tolerated them, accepted them as a necessary evil. And in some communities, something unexpected happened. People started to sympathize with the prisoners. Let me tell you about a town in Colorado. Small farming community. A POW camp was built nearby in 1943. German prisoners were brought in to harvest sugar beets. At first, the townspeople kept their distance. The prisoners were the enemy. Period. But over time, that changed. The prisoners worked hard. They were polite. They didn't cause trouble. And they were young. Many were teenagers or in their early 20s. Boys, really. Sent to war, captured, now stuck in Colorado. Local farmers started bringing the prisoners extra food. A sandwich. An apple. Nothing fancy. Just small kindnesses. One farmer, whose son was serving in Europe, said later, "I looked at those German boys and I thought, somewhere in Germany, maybe a German farmer is being kind to my son. So I'll be kind to these boys." That attitude wasn't universal. But it happened more often than you'd expect. There were also romances. This was controversial. Against regulations. But it happened. German prisoners, working on farms, met local women. They talked. They flirted. They fell in love. After the war, several hundred German POWs returned to America and married women they'd met during their captivity. This caused scandals in some communities. How can you marry a German soldier? The enemy. But love doesn't follow rules. One famous case, a German prisoner named Fritz Engelmann was held at a camp in Utah. He met a local woman named Betty. They fell in love. After the war, he was repatriated to Germany. But he couldn't forget her. In 1947, he returned to America legally, married Betty, and became a U.S. citizen. He lived in Utah for the rest of his life. When interviewed in the 1980s, he said, "I came here as a prisoner. I left as an American." The economic impact of the camps was significant. Prisoners provided labor at a time when labor was desperately needed. They harvested crops, worked in canneries, built roads. Without them, many farms would have failed. Many businesses would have closed. The prisoners were paid minimal wages, 80 cents a day, but the farmers and businesses that used their labor paid the U.S. government standard wages. The government pocketed the difference. This was controversial. Critics argued it was exploitation. But the government's position was clear. Prisoners are not entitled to free market wages. They're working as part of their POW obligations under the Geneva Convention. Despite the controversies, the system worked. Farms stayed productive. The local economy survived. And many prisoners later said the work gave them purpose. It kept them busy, kept their minds occupied, kept them from dwelling on the war or worrying about their families back in Germany. But not everyone was happy. Some American workers resented the prisoners. Why are Germans getting jobs when American veterans need work? This was especially true in the South, where Black Americans had traditionally provided farm labor. Now German prisoners were doing that work, and in some cases, being treated better than black workers. This racial dynamic was ugly and unavoidable. In some southern camps, German POWs were allowed to eat in restaurants that refused to serve Black Americans. They rode in the front of buses while Black Americans had to ride in the back. They were paid more than black laborers for the same work. Some German prisoners were shocked by American racism. They'd been taught that Americans were decadent and morally inferior. But then they saw how Black Americans were treated, and they realized racial hatred wasn't unique to Germany. One German prisoner, interviewed decades later, said, "We were told we were fighting for racial purity. Then I came to America and saw Jim Crow. I realized hate is everywhere. It's not just Germany. It's human nature." And that was a depressing realization. The irony was bitter. German POWs, citizens of a regime that murdered millions based on race, were being treated better than Black American citizens in their own country. This contradiction wasn't lost on everyone. Some black activists pointed it out. Some newspapers editorialized about it. But during the war, with so much else happening, it didn't become a major issue. It was noted, criticized, then largely ignored. After the war, historians would revisit this. It became a case study in American hypocrisy. How could America fight a war against Nazi racism while practicing racism at home? There's no good answer. It just was. May 8, 1945. Germany surrenders. The war in Europe is over. In POW camps across America, German prisoners hear the news. Their reactions vary. Some are relieved. It's over. They'll go home, see their families, rebuild their lives. Others are devastated. Germany has lost. The Reich is destroyed. Everything they believed in, for those who believed, is gone. Some prisoners refuse to believe it. They insist it's Allied propaganda. Germany can't have lost. It's impossible. They wait for news that the surrender was a mistake, that Germany is regrouping, that the war will continue. But as days pass, the truth becomes undeniable. Germany has lost. Unconditionally. The nightmare is over. For the prisoners, though, the war's end doesn't mean immediate freedom. The U.S. government faces a logistical problem. How do you repatriate 400,000 prisoners across the Atlantic when shipping is still needed to bring American soldiers home? The answer: you don't. Not right away. The prisoners stay in the camps. They keep working. They wait. This causes resentment. The war is over. Why are they still prisoners? Why can't they go home? The U.S. government's position: we'll send you home when we have the capacity. In the meantime, you're safe here. You have food, shelter. In Germany, cities are rubble. There's famine, disease. If you went home now, you'd starve. This is true, but it doesn't make the waiting easier. Repatriation begins in late 1945 and continues through 1946. Prisoners are loaded onto ships and sent back to Germany. They're given discharge papers, a small amount of money, and sent on their way. What they find when they get home is devastating. Germany is destroyed. Cities are ruins. Millions are dead. The economy has collapsed. Food is scarce. The country is divided into occupation zones controlled by the Allies. Many prisoners return to find their homes gone. Their families dead or displaced. Everything they knew, erased. Some prisoners, facing this reality, decide they don't want to go home. They want to stay in America. But that's not allowed. The war is over. All prisoners must return. No exceptions. Except, some prisoners don't return. They escape before repatriation. They disappear into American society. George Gartner, the prisoner I mentioned earlier, was one of them. In September 1945, he escaped from the camp in New Mexico. He vanished, assumed a false identity, lived in America illegally for 40 years. He worked odd jobs, moved around, stayed under the radar. He became fluent in English. He adopted American customs. He fell in love with an American woman and wanted to marry her, but he couldn't because he was living under a false name. In 1985, at age 62, Gartner turned himself in. He contacted the FBI and confessed. He was worried about his health. Worried about dying with a false identity. He wanted to die as himself. The FBI arrested him. But then, something unexpected, the U.S. government decided not to prosecute. The war had been over for 40 years. Gartner had lived peacefully, committed no crimes except identity fraud. Prosecuting him served no purpose. Instead, the government granted him legal status. He applied for citizenship. In 1985, George Gartner became an American citizen. Legally. Officially. He lived in California until his death in 2013, at age 90. His story is unusual but not unique. Several dozen German POWs are believed to have escaped and successfully integrated into American society. Most were never caught. They lived out their lives as Americans, their pasts hidden. For the prisoners who were repatriated, life was difficult. Germany was a devastated country. The Marshall Plan would eventually rebuild it, but that took years. In the immediate post-war period, survival was the priority. Some former POWs, having experienced America's prosperity, were bitter. They'd seen how well Americans lived. Now they were back in a destroyed homeland, struggling to find food. It was a harsh contrast. Others were grateful to be home, despite the hardship. They reconnected with surviving family members. They began rebuilding. Slowly, life normalized. And some former POWs maintained connections with America. They wrote letters to the farmers they'd worked for, to the guards they'd befriended, to the townspeople who'd shown them kindness. Some of these relationships lasted decades. In the 1970s and 80s, as the war generation aged, there was renewed interest in the POW camps. Historians began documenting them. Towns where camps had existed started preserving the history. Memorials were built. Museum exhibits created. And something remarkable happened. Former POWs started returning. Not as prisoners. As tourists. As visitors. They came back to see the places where they'd been held. To reconnect with people they'd known. In 1983, a group of former POWs from Camp Concordia, Kansas, returned for a reunion. They met with local residents. They toured the site where the camp had been, now just empty fields. They shared stories, laughed, cried. One former POW said, "I spent 2 years here as a prisoner. I thought I'd hate this place forever. But coming back, I realized those were strange years, but not entirely bad years. I was safe. I was fed. I made friends. I learned about America. Those years shaped me." This sentiment was common among returning POWs. The camps had been a strange interlude. A time out of time. Enemy soldiers living in rural America, working on farms, playing soccer, watching movies. It shouldn't have worked. But somehow, it did. Today, most Americans don't know this history. The POW camps existed for less than 4 years. By 1946, they were gone. The barracks were dismantled. The fences removed. The land returned to farms or forests or developed into suburbs. In some towns, there's still evidence. A historical marker. A preserved building. A section of fence. But mostly, the camps have vanished. And with them, the memory. Why did we forget? Part of the answer is timing. The camps closed in 1946. By 1947, the Cold War was beginning. The focus shifted to the Soviet threat. Germany, West Germany, at least, became an ally. Dwelling on German POWs in American camps felt unnecessary. Possibly awkward. Part of the answer is that the POW camps weren't a major scandal. There were no atrocities. No mass escapes. No violence against civilians. It was a logistical operation that worked reasonably well. Not dramatic enough to be remembered. And part of the answer is that the people who experienced the camps, the prisoners, the guards, the locals, mostly moved on. The prisoners went home. The guards returned to civilian life. The locals went back to their normal routines. Nobody had a strong incentive to preserve the memory. But the history matters. It tells us something important about America and about war. First, it tells us that even in total war, rules can be followed. The U.S. adhered to the Geneva Convention. It treated prisoners humanely. Not perfectly, there were incidents, mistakes, injustices, but overall, the system worked. Prisoners were fed, housed, and returned home alive. This stands in stark contrast to how prisoners were treated on other fronts. Soviet POWs in German camps faced systematic starvation and murder. Allied POWs in Japanese camps faced brutal conditions and high mortality rates. American POWs in German camps were treated relatively well if they were from the West, less well if they were from minority groups. The American POW camps show that humane treatment was possible. That it could be done, even when the enemy had committed atrocities. Second, it tells us about the complexity of war. The prisoners in American camps weren't monsters. They were soldiers. Young men conscripted or enlisted, fighting for their country. Some were Nazis. Many weren't. They were individuals, not a monolith. The Americans who interacted with them, the guards, the farmers, the townspeople, saw this. They saw that the enemy was human. That the propaganda about Germans being evil or subhuman was false. This didn't excuse Germany's crimes. But it complicated the narrative. Third, it tells us about America's capacity for pragmatism. The U.S. needed labor. German POWs provided it. The arrangement benefited both sides. The prisoners got decent treatment and safety. America got labor. It wasn't charity. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. And finally, it tells us about reconciliation. The fact that former German POWs could return to America decades later, not as enemies but as friends, that they could reunite with the people who once guarded them, shows that healing is possible. That old wounds can close. George Gartner, who lived 40 years in America as a fugitive, said something in an interview before his death. I was captured as an enemy. I escaped as a prisoner. I returned as an immigrant. I became a citizen. That's the American story. Anyone can become an American if they choose it. That's idealistic. It glosses over the hardships he faced, the identity fraud, the years of fear. But there's truth in it too. America allowed him to reinvent himself. To shed his past. To start over. Not everyone gets that chance. But the fact that some do, that's worth remembering. The POW camps on U.S. soil are a footnote in history. But footnotes matter. They fill in the gaps. They show us the full picture. Between 1942 and 1946, over 400,000 enemy soldiers lived in America. They worked on farms. They ate in mess halls. They played soccer. They watched American movies. They learned about democracy. Some hated it. Some loved it. Some came back after the war. This happened in your grandparents' generation. In towns across America. In places that look ordinary today but were once surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The camps are gone. But the history remains. In archives. in photographs, in the memories of the few surviving witnesses. And now, the POW camps in America, the hidden history, the story in your backyard.